I had been at work for over 12 hours that day. It was one of those days when everything seems to go wrong and every problem feels bigger than it should. By the time I finally got to leave, the office was dark and the parking lot was almost empty. I just wanted to go home, throw myself on the couch, and forget the world. The drive home was supposed to be a peaceful end to a horrible day. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The roads were empty, which was a bit strange but not totally unusual for this late hour. I turned on the radio, but it didn't help much. The only sound that really filled the car was the hum of the engine and the occasional thump when the tires hit a bump. My headlights cut through the darkness, creating a tunnel of light on the lonely road. The darkness outside felt like a heavy blanket, comforting but suffocating at the same time. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. A car was behind me, not too close, but close enough that I could see it clearly. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was someone else heading home late, just like me. But as I kept driving, I realized the car wasn't just behind me. It was matching my speed, following every turn I made. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. We were probably just going the same way. But when I made a random turn down a side street, the car followed. My stomach twisted into a knot. I took another turn, and the car did the same. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my palms sweaty. The road ahead was empty, but the car behind me was now closer, its headlights bright in my rearview mirror. The feeling of being followed grew stronger with every second. I took another random turn, hoping to lose the car, but it stuck with me. I started to panic. My breath came faster, and my heart pounded in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone lost, or maybe they lived nearby. But a part of me knew something was wrong. The car wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. I decided to test the driver. I slowed down almost to a stop, hoping they would pass me. But instead of passing, the car slowed down too, keeping the same distance. That's when I knew for sure that something was wrong. My panic turned into full-blown fear. I pressed down on the gas pedal, speeding up, hoping to put some distance between us. The car sped up too. I started driving erratically, taking sharp turns, doubling back, trying to lose the car. But no matter what I did, it stayed on my tail. The driver began flashing their headlights, almost blinding me in the mirror. They were getting closer, almost tailgating me now. I felt trapped, like an animal being chased by a predator. The quiet night had turned into a nightmare, every shadow outside the car feeling like it was hiding something terrible. I thought about calling the police, but my phone was in my bag, somewhere on the passenger seat, and I didn't dare take my hands off the wheel. I was too afraid to stop, too afraid to slow down. The thought of pulling over, of letting the car catch up to me, made my blood run cold. I passed by a few gas stations, but they were all closed, dark and empty. There was no one around to help. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I knew I couldn't keep driving forever. I needed to do something, anything, to end this. That's when I remembered the old road that ran parallel to the main highway. It was narrow and winding, almost forgotten, but I knew it well. It wasn't the fastest way home, but it was my only chance. I took a sharp turn onto the road, tires screeching as I almost lost control. The car behind me hesitated for a moment, but then it followed. The road was as bad as I remembered, full of twists and turns that made it hard to see what was ahead. I drove as fast as I could, pushing the car to its limits, hoping the driver behind would make a mistake, would lose control and crash, but they didn't. They stayed close, their headlights burning into my rearview mirror. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The road was getting worse, narrower, and more winding. I couldn't keep this up much longer. One wrong move, and I would end up in the ditch. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. A loud screech, followed by the sound of metal on metal. I looked in the rearview mirror just in time to see the car behind me veer off the road, crashing into a ditch. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the side of the road. My hands were shaking, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and fear. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt a cold dread creeping over me. I knew I should get out, check on the driver, but I couldn't move. What if this was some kind of trick? What if they were waiting for me to get out? I glanced back at the wreckage, half hidden in the darkness. The car was still, no movement, no sound. I reached for my phone, finally pulling it out of my bag. My fingers hovered over the screen, ready to call for help, but something stopped me. What if I was just imagining things? What if there was nothing wrong and I was overreacting? But what if I wasn't? I sat there, torn between doing the right thing and protecting myself. The night was still, the only sound the distant hum of the engine. The road ahead was empty, leading back to the safety of home. I could drive away, pretend this never happened, leave the nightmare behind. But as I reached for the gear shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the danger was still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I drove away, but the feeling stayed with me, haunting me every time I looked in the rearview mirror. Every car behind me, every pair of headlights sent a shiver down my spine. I had escaped, but the fear, the paranoia, followed me home. I was driving late, much later than I had planned. The road was empty, stretching out in front of me like a black ribbon under the dull light of the moon. I had the radio on, just to keep myself awake, but it wasn't helping much. The news was all bad, as usual. Robberies, assaults, and something about an escaped criminal that made me shiver. I didn't pay much attention to it, though. I just wanted to get home. The road seemed to go on forever, cutting through the middle of nowhere. Trees on either side, thick and dark, were blocking out what little light the sky offered. I hadn't seen another car in miles, and the quiet was starting to get to me. My eyelids felt heavy, and I shook my head, trying to stay awake. Maybe I should have pulled over and rested for a bit, but I didn't want to be on this road any longer than I had to. Then I saw him. A figure standing by the side of the road, thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. For a second, I thought about driving right past him. It wasn't smart to pick up strangers, especially not this late at night. But he looked so desperate, standing there in the cold. I figured he was just some poor guy trying to get home, like me. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and stopped. He walked over to the car, and I noticed he looked rough, dirty clothes, unshaven, and his eyes had this hollow look to them. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he'd just been out here too long. I unlocked the door and he got in without saying a word. For a few minutes, we drove in silence. He didn't say much at first, just mumbled something about the weather being cold. I agreed, keeping my eyes on the road. I didn't want to seem rude, but I wasn't up for small talk. The night was already unsettling enough. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking. Just talking about random things. His voice was flat, almost bored, but the things he said weren't normal. He talked about violence like it was nothing. Told me stories about people he knew who had done horrible things in gruesome detail. The way he described it, like he was just talking about the weather, made my skin crawl. I tried to keep calm, to not let it show that his stories were bothering me. I didn't want to seem scared or give him any reason to think I was onto him. but my heart was pounding, and I was starting to regret ever picking him up. Then something clicked in my head. His face, his voice, the things he was saying. It all started to come together. I remembered the news from earlier. The escaped criminal they had mentioned, the one who was dangerous, who had done terrible things. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the realization washed over me. Could this guy be him? I glanced over at him. He was staring out the window, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach turn. Did he know that I knew? Was he just waiting for me to make a move, to panic? I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I needed to get out of this situation, and fast. Suddenly, he changed the subject. He started talking about the crimes that had been on the news, describing them in detail that made my blood run cold. He spoke as if he knew exactly what had happened, where, and how. It wasn't just the kind of information you'd get from watching the news. It was like he had been there, like he had done it. My suspicion turned to fear. I knew then, without a doubt, that I was sitting next to the man the police were looking for. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I needed to get away, but I couldn't just stop and let him know I was onto him. I had to think of something, some excuse, some way to get him out of the car without setting him off. We were coming up to a small intersection, the first one in miles. There was a stop sign ahead, and I slowed down, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind raced, searching for an excuse. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I think I might have a flat tire. I should check it out, just to be safe." He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with those cold eyes. My heart skipped a beat, thinking maybe he wouldn't buy it. But then he nodded slowly. "Sure," he said, his voice calm, too calm. Better safe than sorry. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. I was trying to think of what to do next, how to get him out and keep myself safe. As soon as the car stopped, I reached for the door handle, but so did he. For a split second, we both froze. Then, without thinking, I slammed the door open, hitting him hard. He let out a grunt of pain, and I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I jumped out of the car and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back, didn't care where I was going, just ran as fast as I could into the trees. I heard the car door slam behind me and footsteps following, but I didn't stop. I kept running, the fear driving me forward. The last thing I heard was his voice, calling after me, calm and steady, promising that he would find me. I don't remember how long I ran or how I eventually found help. All I know is that I survived, barely. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that he's still out there, waiting, watching, and I'll never know if one day he'll find me again. I had just finished the longest day at work. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it was made of stone. All I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and collapse into bed. The clock on my dashboard glowed 11:47 p.m., way too late for a weekday. As I pulled out of the office parking lot, I was relieved to see the roads empty, dark, and quiet. Too quiet, actually. The kind of quiet that makes you feel alone, even when you're not. I tried not to think too much about it. It was late, I was tired, and I needed to focus on the road. But something about the darkness around me felt different tonight, thicker somehow. My headlights barely cut through it, and the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I shook it off, focusing on getting home. I noticed the first strange thing after about 10 minutes. I passed a broken-down bus stop, just an old, rusty bench under a flickering light. The kind of place where nobody would wait for a bus at this hour. I remember thinking it was odd because I didn't recall ever seeing it before. But then again, I was tired, so I just kept driving. A few minutes later, I saw the same bus stop again. Same rusty bench, same flickering light. I frowned, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I checked my phone for directions, but the screen showed no service. Great, just what I needed. Still, I told myself it was fine. I'd figure it out. I kept driving, but then I saw it a third time. The bus stop, the same one. My heart started to race. I couldn't be lost. I knew these roads like the back of my hand. Yet there it was, as if mocking me. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself that maybe there were just a lot of bus stops that looked the same around here. I mean, I had to be wrong, right? I took the next right, trying to shake the weird feeling creeping up my spine. But as I continued driving, I noticed the landmarks were repeating. The same bus stop, a lone flickering streetlight, an old abandoned gas station. Again and again, no matter how many turns I made, no matter how fast I drove. Panic started to set in. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel and sweat dripped down my back. What was happening? I couldn't be stuck. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe this was some kind of twisted dream. I tried to focus, tried to think logically, but my thoughts were spiraling out of control. I decided to pull over. I needed to collect myself, get my head straight. I stepped out of the car and stood in the middle of the road. The silence was deafening. The same landmarks loomed in the distance, waiting for me to return. I started walking, thinking that maybe on foot, I could find something different, something that would make sense. But the more I walked, the more everything stayed the same. I kept ending up back at the car, no matter which way I went. By now, I was really losing it. I shouted into the darkness, hoping for a response, for anything. But there was nothing, just the echo of my own voice. I pulled out my phone again, but the no service message hadn't changed. I was completely alone, or at least that's what I thought. I don't know how long I walked, but at some point I saw a figure up ahead. A person standing by the road, barely visible in the dim light. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and hope. I ran toward them, desperate for any kind of help. As I got closer, I could see it was an older man, wearing clothes that looked out of place, like from another time. He didn't seem surprised to see me, which should have made me feel better. But it didn't. Something about him felt off, like he was too calm, too relaxed, as if he'd been expecting me. "Please, can you help me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I think I'm lost, and I can't find my way out." He looked at me with sad eyes, then shook his head slowly. "You're not lost," he said quietly. "You're stuck, just like me." "There's no way out." My heart dropped into my stomach. "What do you mean stuck?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "I've been here for years," he said, almost too calmly. "You can't escape this place. No one can. Once you're here for good." I stumbled back, shaking my head in disbelief. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. He wasn't lying. He wasn't messing with me. He was telling the truth. And it was the last thing I wanted to hear. I turned and ran back to my car, not caring about anything else. I had to get out, had to try something, anything. But as I drove, the landmarks kept repeating, mocking me with their unchanging presence. The bus stop, the street light, the gas station, over and over, until I couldn't take it anymore. Eventually, I stopped trying. I was exhausted, defeated. The old man's words echoed in my mind, and I knew he was right. There was no escape. I was part of this now, just another lost soul trapped in an endless loop. Now I just drive. I don't know why. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's hope that someday something will change. But deep down, I know it won't. I'm stuck here, and this nightmare is my new reality. And every time I pass that damn bus stop, I feel a little piece of myself slip away. There's no way out. There never was. I've been driving the same car for years, a beat-up old sedan that's seen better days. It's got its quirks, but it's reliable. Or at least it was until this smell started. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I left some food in the back seat, or maybe something spilled. I've got a busy life, and sometimes I just don't have time to clean it out as well as I should. But the smell? It didn't go away. It got worse. Day after day, it grew stronger, and soon, it was all I could think about every time I got in the car. It was this thick, sour odor that clung to the seats and filled my nose. It made my head spin and my stomach churn. I kept putting off dealing with it, telling myself I'd clean out the car on the weekend, but I never did. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. The smell was unbearable, like something rotting deep inside the car. It was starting to make me feel sick, and I knew I had to do something about it. So, one afternoon, when I had some time to spare, I decided to figure out what was going on. I pulled over on a quiet road where nobody would see me and got out of the car. The smell hit me even harder once I was outside. It was definitely coming from the trunk. I hadn't opened the trunk in a while. There was nothing I needed to put back there. Maybe I had forgotten something in there a long time ago, and it was finally starting to rot. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the trunk and lifted it open. The smell almost knocked me over. I had to cover my mouth and nose with my sleeve to keep from gagging. Inside the trunk, there was something big and wrapped in layers of old, dirty cloth. I stared at it, confused and scared. How did this get here? I didn't remember putting anything like this in my trunk. I couldn't even think of a time when I opened the trunk recently. I reached in and touched the cloth. It was damp and sticky. My heart started racing as I realized that this wasn't just trash or old clothes. It was something much worse. I began to unwrap the layers, peeling them away one by one. The closer I got to the center, the more the smell intensified until I could hardly breathe. When I finally uncovered what was inside, I froze. It was a body, partially decayed, the skin pale and bloated. The face was unrecognizable, but it was clear enough that this was a human being. My mind went blank. How could this be in my trunk? How could I not have noticed it before? Panic set in. My thoughts were racing, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Did I put this here? Did I kill someone? No, that couldn't be right. I'm not that kind of person. I've never even been in a fight, let alone done something like this. But then, how else could this body have ended up in my car? Was someone trying to frame me? I stumbled back from the trunk, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't think straight. What was I supposed to do? If I called the police, they'd think I was guilty. But if I didn't, what then? Just leave the body there and hope nobody finds out? I couldn't live with myself if I did that. But I also couldn't go to jail for something I didn't do, or maybe didn't remember doing. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what to do. The sun was starting to set, and the light was fading. I knew I didn't have much time before someone would notice me, or worse, the smell. But I couldn't move. I was trapped between fear and disbelief, my mind playing tricks on me. Finally, I made a decision. I couldn't leave the body there. That much was clear. But I also couldn't let anyone find it. My hands were still trembling as I grabbed the cloth and started wrapping the body back up. I needed to get rid of it, somewhere far away, where nobody would ever find it. As I finished wrapping the body, I realized that I didn't know where to go or what to do. My mind was still spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Was this really happening? Was I really about to dispose of a body? It all felt like a bad dream. something that couldn't possibly be real. But the smell, the weight of the body in the trunk, the panic in my chest, they were all real. I was in deep, and there was no easy way out. I closed the trunk, wiped my hands on my pants, and got back into the car. The smell was still there, hanging in the air like a ghost. It followed me as I drove away, making it impossible to forget what I had just seen. As I drove, the questions kept coming. What if someone saw me? What if the police were already looking for this person? What if I couldn't get rid of the body? The road ahead seemed endless, and so did the dread in my heart. By the time I finally stopped, it was pitch dark, and I was in the middle of nowhere. I got out of the car and opened the trunk again. The smell hit me just as hard as before, reminding me of the horror that lay within. I knew what I had to do, but I still didn't know if I could actually do it. And then, something strange happened. As I stood there, staring at the wrapped body, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It was like someone was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. I spun around, but there was nobody there, just me and the darkness. That's when I realized that maybe I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe someone really was out there, waiting for me to make a mistake. Maybe they were the ones who put the body in my trunk, just to see how I would react. Or maybe it was all in my head. I don't know what I did next. The memory is fuzzy, like a dream that fades as soon as you wake up. All I remember is getting back in the car and driving away, the smell still lingering in the air, the weight of what I'd done, or thought I'd done, heavy on my shoulders. Now, every time I get in the car, I can still smell it, faint but unmistakable. It's a constant reminder of that day, of the horror I found in my trunk, and of the dark questions that still haunt me. I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but one thing is certain: I'll never forget the smell. I should have known better than to drive through a remote area at dusk, but there I was, miles away from the nearest town, when my car sputtered and died. No warning, just a final cough from the engine, and then silence. I turned the key again and again, but nothing. It was getting darker, and the trees around me seemed to close in, swallowing the light. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal. It felt like the world was closing in on me, the panic rising in my throat. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I remembered passing a house about a mile back. It was old, maybe even a bit creepy, but at this point, I didn't have a choice. I locked the car and started walking, the crunch of gravel under my feet the only sound in the stillness. The house came into view, its silhouette dark against the deepening sky. It looked better than I remembered, like someone had been taking care of it, but something about it still felt off. I tried to shake the feeling as I approached the front door and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, like they had been waiting for me. A middle-aged couple stood there, smiling too widely. The man, tall and thin with graying hair, greeted me with an almost too friendly tone, asking if I needed help. His wife, short and plump, hovered behind him, her eyes darting between me and the darkening road behind. I explained what happened, and before I could even ask, they insisted I come in, offering me food and a place to rest while they figured out the car problem. I didn't want to stay, but what choice did I have? The nearest town was too far to walk at night, and they seemed nice enough, if a bit eager. Inside, the house was surprisingly well kept, almost cozy, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way they kept glancing at each other, or how the man casually mentioned that it had been a long time since they had visitors. They showed me to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house, telling me to make myself comfortable. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to ignore the creeping unease that was building inside me. Something was wrong here, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to leave as soon as possible, but when I mentioned getting back to my car, they both brushed it off, saying it could wait until morning. The way they said it, like it was a command rather than a suggestion, sent a chill down my spine. The hours dragged on, and the more time I spent in that house, the more I noticed things that didn't add up. The way they subtly blocked the exits, always standing too close to the doors. The strange, muffled noises I heard coming from behind closed doors, noises they pretended not to hear. And the way they seemed to be hiding something, especially when I asked about using their phone to call for a tow. The wife just smiled and said, "No service out here, dear." It was late when I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I had to leave, even if it meant walking through the night. As I made my way down the hallway, I noticed a door that was slightly ajar, something I hadn't seen before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. It was a small room, empty except for a bed and a dresser, but what caught my attention were the scratches on the inside of the door, deep and fresh, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard the creak of floorboards behind me. I turned to find the couple standing there, their smiles gone, replaced by something cold and dangerous. The man stepped forward, blocking my escape. "You shouldn't have snooped," he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart pounded as I realized they had no intention of letting me leave. I had to think fast. I mumbled something about needing fresh air and made a move toward the front door. The wife tried to stop me, but I managed to slip past her, adrenaline giving me strength. I reached the door and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. Just as I got it open, I felt the man's hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. I kicked out, connecting with his shin, and broke free, running out into the night. The cold air hit my face as I sprinted across the yard. My only thought was to get away. Behind me, I could hear them calling out, their voices eerily calm, like they knew I'd come back. I didn't stop to look back, pushing through the trees, the branches scratching at my arms and face. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I kept running, my fear driving me forward. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a road. I was exhausted, my legs barely holding me up, but I forced myself to keep going. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and I waved frantically, praying the driver would stop. The car slowed, and I almost collapsed in relief as the driver, an older man, rolled down his window. I blurted out something about needing help, and without asking questions, he told me to get in. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The couple was standing at the edge of the woods watching us leave. Their faces were just visible in the glow of the car's taillights, expressionless, like they were just waiting for their next chance. I slumped back in the seat, trying to calm my racing heart, but the fear didn't fade. I had escaped, but I knew I would never be free from the memory of that house and the couple who lived there. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for someone else to come knocking. I've been a rideshare driver for a while now. It's not the worst job. You meet a lot of different people, some nice, some not so nice. But I've learned to keep my head down, do my job, and get through the night. The late night shifts are usually quiet, and I prefer it that way. But last night was different. Last night I picked up a passenger who made me question if I'd make it through the night at all. It started like any other night. The streets were mostly empty, just the usual glow of streetlights and the occasional car passing by. I was heading toward the outskirts of the city when I got a ping to pick someone up. The location was a dimly lit street, not far from an industrial area. I didn't think much of it. People get rides from strange places all the time. When I arrived, I saw him standing under a flickering street light. He was in his mid-30s maybe, but what struck me was his clothes. He was wearing a thick, heavy coat, the kind you'd wear in winter. But it was a warm night, too warm for that kind of outfit. I thought maybe he had come from somewhere cold, or maybe he was homeless. Either way, I didn't want to judge. He got into the car without saying much, just gave me a nod and a vague instruction. Take me somewhere quiet. That was the first red flag. Somewhere quiet? What did that even mean? But I've learned not to ask too many questions. I started driving, heading toward a quieter part of the city, away from the downtown lights and noise. At first, we drove in silence. I could feel his eyes on me through the rearview mirror, like he was studying me. Then he started asking questions, simple at first. Where do you live? Do you have a family? How long have you been driving? I answered politely, keeping it vague. But the questions got more personal, more invasive. He asked if I drove this late every night, if anyone knew where I was. I started to feel uneasy, like he was trying to figure out how alone I was. He smiled, a thin, almost lifeless smile, and said something that sent a chill down my spine. It's funny, isn't it? How easy it would be to disappear at night. No one would even notice until morning. I didn't respond. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself he was just talking, that I was overthinking it. But the darkness outside and the empty streets made it hard to ignore the fear creeping in. Then he made the request that pushed me over the edge. Turn here, he said, pointing to a narrow, barely lit road that led away from the main streets. I need to pick something up. I didn't want to. Everything inside me was screaming not to, but I didn't want to make him angry. What if he had a weapon? What if he was planning something? My hands were shaking as I turned onto the road, which quickly turned into a winding path through a wooded area. There were no streetlights now, just the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the trees. The road was rough, full of potholes, and the branches above cast long shadows that seemed to move with us. The further we went, the more isolated I felt. Finally, he told me to stop. We were in the middle of nowhere, just trees all around us. He opened the door and got out, then leaned back in. Stay here, he said, his voice low and firm. I watched him disappear into the trees, and that's when the fear really hit me. I was alone, in the dark, on a deserted road, with no idea what he was doing or what he'd come back with. I thought about driving away, just leaving him there. But what if he caught me? What if he was waiting for me to try something? I felt trapped. My mind was racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if he came back with something dangerous? What if this was his plan all along? I thought about calling someone, but who would I call? What would I even say? Minutes felt like hours, but eventually I saw him coming back. He was carrying something, a small bundle wrapped in a dirty cloth. He got back into the car, still eerily calm, and placed the bundle on his lap. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't want to know. Drive, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I started the car, my hands still trembling. Where to? I asked, hoping he'd say somewhere close, somewhere with people. Just keep driving, he replied. We drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the trees outside. The road seemed to go on forever, deeper into the woods, further from any sign of life. My mind was racing with thoughts of what could happen next, each one more terrifying than the last. Then, out of nowhere, he gave me a new destination. It was even more remote, a place I didn't recognize, far from the city. My stomach twisted in knots. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I was too scared to confront him, too scared to try and run. As I drove, my mind kept going over the options, trying to figure out a way out. But with every mile, the options seemed to disappear. just like the road behind us. The more I thought about it, the more trapped I felt. It was like the darkness outside was closing in, suffocating me, and the fear inside was growing, making it hard to think straight. We drove on, the car cutting through the darkness, heading toward a place I didn't want to go. And as we went deeper into the night, I realized that I might never come back from this drive. I wish I could tell you what happened next, but I'm still here, driving with no end in sight. I never imagined it would end up like this. The night it happened, I was just tired, trying to get home after a long day. The road was dark, and there was no one around. I remember looking at my phone for just a second, just to check the time. But when I looked up, it was too late. Someone was in front of my car. The thud was loud, like hitting a deer. My heart stopped. I panicked. I didn't get out to check, didn't even think to call for help. Instead, I slammed the gas pedal and drove away, my mind racing. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had hit someone. I could feel the guilt starting to choke me even as I drove further from the scene, but I couldn't turn back. Not now. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, talked to my friends, even managed to smile. But everything felt different. Every noise seemed louder. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. I kept expecting someone to walk up and say they knew what I did, that they saw me. I couldn't turn on the news without feeling sick. The stories about missing persons made my stomach twist. Was it them? Was it the person I hit? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Nights were the worst. I couldn't sleep, just lay there with my eyes open, staring into the dark. Sometimes I'd see something in the corner of my eye, a shadow, a shape. But when I looked, there was nothing. My mind was playing tricks on me, but it felt so real. It felt like someone was there, in the room with me, watching me. I started leaving the lights on, but it didn't help. The guilt was like a weight on my chest, crushing me. I thought I could just live with it, that the feeling would go away, but it didn't. It only got worse. After a few days, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back, had to see if there was anything at the scene. Maybe if I found nothing, I could convince myself it was all in my head. So I went back. It was late, the same time as before. The road was just as dark, just as empty. My hands were shaking as I drove, my heart pounding in my ears. When I got to the spot, I pulled over, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to get out, didn't want to see what might be there. But I forced myself to do it. The road was quiet, too quiet. I looked around, searching for any sign of what happened. At first, I saw nothing. Relief washed over me, but then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There, on a sign by the road, someone had written something. I walked closer, my heart racing faster with each step. The words were scratched into the dirt. I saw you. I felt like the ground was slipping away beneath me. Someone had seen what I did. Someone knew. I ran back to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning. Who saw me? How long had they known? Were they watching me now? From that moment on, nothing felt right. I started to see the same car everywhere I went. It was always a different color, different make. But it felt like the same car, the same person inside, watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Paranoia started to eat away at me. I stopped trusting people, even my closest friends. Every time someone called or texted, I was sure they knew. Every look felt suspicious. Then, one day, I found a note slipped under my door. I don't know how they knew where I lived, but they did. The note was simple, just a few words that made my blood run cold. confess, or face the consequences. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to confront whoever was doing this. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had to make it stop. I followed the instructions in the note, meeting the person at a quiet spot outside of town. When I got there, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. My mind was a mess, trying to figure out what I would say, what I would do. When I arrived, a man was waiting, his face hidden in the shadows. I demanded to know who he was, why he was doing this. His voice was calm, too calm. He told me he saw everything that night, saw what I did. He told me that if I didn't confess, he would make sure everyone knew, that I would lose everything. I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning, my heart racing. I couldn't let this ruin my life, but I couldn't live with the guilt any longer. The man's voice cut through my thoughts, cold and final. This is your last chance. I made my choice. I left the meeting, my mind numb, my body shaking. I couldn't go to the police, couldn't risk everything. But as I drove away, something didn't feel right. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man following me. But there was nothing, just the dark road behind me. I thought I was safe, that it was over. But when I got home, I found another note waiting for me, sitting on my bed. My heart stopped when I read it. The words were the same as before, but this time they felt different, more threatening. I saw you. I never found out who was behind it, but I know they're still out there, watching me. Every day I live with the fear that they'll come back, that they'll make good on their threats. I don't know how much longer I can take it. I don't know if I'll ever be free. I have always loved driving through the mountains. There's something peaceful about the quiet roads, the way the trees seem to close in around you, and the view of the sunset dipping behind the peaks. But I know these roads can be dangerous at night. They twist and turn with sharp bends, and sometimes there are accidents, the kind where people don't walk away. But I'm careful. I've driven these roads so many times that I feel like I know them by heart. It was late afternoon when I started my drive. The sun was low, casting long shadows on the road. I wasn't in a hurry, just enjoying the ride. But then I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. It was far away at first, just a tiny dot. But then it got closer, much closer. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was just trying to get home before dark. But then the car started flashing its headlights. On a winding road like this, it felt aggressive. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that they were just impatient, maybe in a rush. But the more I ignored it, the closer they got, tailing me so closely that I could almost see the anger in their headlights. I decided to speed up a bit, hoping to create some distance. But the road was getting narrower, and with every turn, the car stayed right on my bumper. My heart started to race. I looked for a place to pull over, but the road just seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no safe spots to stop. The car kept tailgating me, their headlights glaring in my mirror, almost blinding me. I could feel the tension rising, the way my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I thought about slowing down. Maybe they'd just go around me. But each time I eased off the gas, the car behind me did the same. I began to panic. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. There were no other cars, no sign of help, just me and this aggressive driver. And the road was only getting more dangerous as the light faded. I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep driving like this, not with this car right on top of me. Finally, I saw a small turnout ahead. It wasn't much, just a bit of gravel on the side of the road, but it was my only option. I slowed down, signaling to the driver behind me that I was going to let them pass. But when I pulled over, they did too. They stopped right behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. My mind raced through 1,000 thoughts. Why weren't they passing? Why had they stopped? And then the fear hit me like a punch to the gut. What did they want? I watched in my mirror as the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall and broad, wearing dark clothes. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he knew exactly what he was going to do. There was something about the way he walked, the way he looked at my car, that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just road rage. This was something far worse. I fumbled for the lock, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys. I managed to lock the doors just as he reached the car. He stood there for a moment, looking down at me through the window. His face was in shadow, but I could see the menace in his eyes, the way his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. For a second, we just stared at each other. The only sound was my own breathing, harsh and fast. Then he reached out and tried the door handle. When it didn't open, he slammed his hand against the window, making me jump. I could feel the glass shake under the impact. I knew I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the road anymore, didn't care about the bends and the turns. I just needed to escape. My hands were still trembling as I started the car again, the engine roaring to life. He banged on the window again, harder this time, but I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I hit the gas, the tires skidding on the gravel as I pulled back onto the road. I glanced in the mirror as I sped away and saw him running back to his car. My heart sank. He wasn't going to let me go that easily. The road was a blur as I drove as fast as I could, taking the turns at a speed that would have scared me at any other time. But fear was driving me now, pushing me to go faster, to get away from whatever this man wanted. I could see his headlights behind me again, closer and closer, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I don't know how long I drove like that, my heart pounding in my ears, my eyes glued to the road. But eventually, the headlights began to fade. The road opened up, and I saw a light ahead, a gas station. I veered off the road, pulling into the station so fast that I nearly hit the pump. I sat there for a moment, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I looked in the mirror, but the car was gone. The road was empty again, like it had all been some horrible nightmare. But the fear was still there, the feeling that it wasn't over. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't found that station, if I hadn't been able to get away. But even now, I can't stop thinking about it. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those headlights again, expecting to see him. I don't know if I'll ever drive that road again, and if I do, I'll never drive it alone. I still can't believe how fast everything went wrong. What was supposed to be a simple road trip turned into something I can barely describe without feeling sick to my stomach. I'm writing this down because I need to get it out, but I don't know if anyone will believe me. It all started when my friend Jason and I decided to take a weekend off. We were both stressed from work and needed a break. Jason found this cabin a few hours away, nestled in the woods where we could just relax, drink, and forget about life for a while. The drive was supposed to be straightforward, but we got a late start, and by the time we hit the road, the sun was already starting to set. We'd been driving for a couple of hours when Jason suggested taking a shortcut he found online. It would shave off an hour from our trip, and we were all for it. The GPS showed a small road that cut through some rural areas, and at first, it seemed fine. But as we went further, the road got narrower, and the trees seemed to close in on us. The sun dipped lower, and I felt a weird sense of unease. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves. The GPS started acting up, sending us in circles. We couldn't find any road signs, and the ones we did see were so worn out that we couldn't read them. Jason was getting frustrated, and I was too, but we didn't want to admit we were lost. Then, out of nowhere, the car sputtered and died. Just like that, We were stuck on this deserted dirt road, no cell service, nothing. We sat there in silence, the car ticking as it cooled down. Jason tried starting the car again, but it was dead. No lights, no engine sound, just dead. We were miles from anywhere, and it was getting dark fast. I suggested we walk back the way we came, hoping to find a house or a gas station. So, we grabbed a flashlight, locked the car, and started walking. An hour passed, and we didn't see a single house. But then, in the distance, we saw a dim light. We quickened our pace, and eventually, we came upon a farmhouse. It looked old, but the lights were on, so we thought maybe someone could help us. We knocked on the door, and after a long wait, an old man answered. He looked at us like we were something that crawled out of the swamp. His eyes were cold, and his face was twisted with something between anger and fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not inviting us in. Jason explained our situation, but the old man just shook his head. "Outsiders don't belong here. You need to leave. Now." His voice was firm, and there was no arguing with him. Jason tried to press, but the man just repeated himself, louder this time. We had no choice but to turn around and leave. As we walked away, I felt this chill down my spine. The way that man looked at us, the way he spoke, it wasn't right. I told Jason we should have kept knocking or pushed harder for help, but he was just as creeped out as I was and didn't want to go back. It was full dark by the time we got back to where we thought we left the car, but it wasn't there. I swear, we walked in the right direction, but it was like the car had just vanished. We stood there, confused, when we started hearing something. Footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone was walking a good distance behind us. I spun around with the flashlight, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jason nodded, his face pale. We started walking faster, trying to find the road again, but the footsteps followed us. They weren't close, but they were steady, always the same distance behind. We sped up, almost running now, but it didn't help. The sound just kept pace with us, like whatever it was, wasn't even trying hard to keep up. We were completely lost, and no matter which direction we went, we ended up in the same spot. A large oak tree with deep, claw-like marks on its trunk. We must have passed that tree 3 or 4 times, and every time, I felt more and more panic. Jason was muttering under his breath, something about being hunted, but I couldn't focus. All I knew was we had to keep moving. Then the footsteps started getting louder, faster. Whatever was following us had decided to close the distance. We broke into a sprint, crashing through the underbrush, barely able to see where we were going. I could hear Jason breathing hard beside me, but I didn't dare slow down. We stumbled into a clearing, and there they were, a group of people standing in the dark, waiting for us. They didn't say anything at first, just watched us with these dead eyes. Then one of them, a tall man with a scarred face, stepped forward. "You've been trespassing," he said, his voice low and cold. "No one comes here without our say-so, and no one leaves." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but I was frozen. Jason tried to talk to them, to reason, but they just moved in closer. The scarred man grabbed Jason, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He yelled for me to run, and somehow, my legs obeyed. I bolted into the woods, hearing Jason's screams behind me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The footsteps were behind me again, faster now, almost playful. I ran until my lungs burned, but I couldn't escape them. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I tripped and fell, scraping my knees and hands. I lay there, too scared to move, waiting for whatever was chasing me to catch up. But the footsteps just stopped. I was alone, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. I must have passed out because the next thing I remember, it was morning, and I was lying on the side of a highway. A passing car found me, and they called the police. But when they went back to look for Jason or the car, they found nothing. No farmhouse, no clearing, no signs of anyone else. I've told the story a dozen times, but no one believes me. They say Jason must have just left, that I imagined everything in a panic. But I know what happened. I can still hear those footsteps when I close my eyes at night, and sometimes I wonder if they'll ever stop following me. It was late, probably past midnight, when I finally got into my car. The road was completely empty, not a single car in sight. I was tired, more tired than I had been in a long time. The day had been long, stressful, and all I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget everything. The road was dark, too dark. The headlights cut through the blackness, but it felt like the shadows were just waiting for a chance to swallow me whole. I could hear the engine humming softly, the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the night. Sometimes I could hear the wind rustling the trees, making them sway and bend. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was just because I was tired. I turned on the radio to keep me company, tuning into some old rock station. The music was comforting in a way, familiar. I kept my eyes on the road, not thinking about anything in particular, just focused on getting home. That's when my phone buzzed. I thought it might be a work email or a random spam text, but something made me check it. The message was from an unknown number. It said, "Nice choice in music." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. That was weird. How could anyone know what I was listening to? I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was someone playing a prank on me. But still, I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept driving, but my mind wasn't on the road anymore. The unease was growing. A few minutes later, another buzz, another message. "You're driving a bit fast, don't you think?" My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I glanced at the speedometer. I was doing just over the speed limit, but how could anyone know that? There were no cars around, no one to see me. I quickly looked out the windows, expecting to see headlights or someone hiding in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dark trees lining it. The messages kept coming, each one more detailed, more personal. "That crack in your windshield is getting worse." My eyes darted to the small crack on the passenger side of the glass. It was true. The crack had been there for a while, but how did this person know about it? Panic started to set in. My breath quickened. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was someone from work messing with me, or maybe a friend playing a joke. But none of my friends would do this, especially this late at night. Then a new message. "You just passed the Pine Street sign. You're getting close." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. They were watching me. Someone was watching me, and I had no idea where they were or what they wanted. I wanted to scream, to stop the car and run. But where would I go? I decided to take a different route, a longer one, hoping to shake off whoever was watching. I turned left instead of right, heading down a road I never used. But the messages kept coming, describing every turn, every road sign, every movement I made. Smart move, taking the back road. But it won't help. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, speeding down the narrow, winding road. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The car's engine roared as I pushed it faster, desperate to get away from whoever was out there. But the messages turned darker, more threatening. "If you keep speeding, you won't make it home." I couldn't take it anymore. I needed help. I reached for my phone, thinking about calling the police. But then another message came in. Don't even think about calling anyone or you'll regret it. My hand froze. What was I supposed to do? I was trapped, alone, and terrified. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and my phone, waiting for the next message, the next command. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the darkness was closing in on me. Then, the final message came. Turn off your headlights. Now. I didn't want to obey, but what choice did I have? My fingers shook as I reached for the switch, plunging the car into darkness. I couldn't see anything, just the faint outline of the road in front of me, barely visible under the moonlight. The road twisted and turned, and I slowed down, trying to keep control. But I knew I couldn't keep driving like this. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But there was nothing. No escape. No way to get away from whoever was out there, watching me, controlling me. Finally, the road came to a dead end. My heart sank as I realized there was nowhere else to go. The trees loomed tall and menacing around me, blocking out the sky. I felt completely isolated, cut off from the world. The last message appeared on my screen. Get out of the car. And that was it. My hands were trembling, my body frozen with fear. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, and I knew that whatever was waiting for me outside the car wasn't going to be good. The story ends here, not because I want it to, but because I don't know what happened next. I don't remember, or maybe I don't want to remember. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I think I can hear my phone buzzing, and I'm too scared to check. I was driving home late one night, much later than usual. The road was almost empty, stretching ahead like a dark ribbon through the middle of nowhere. My eyes were heavy, and all I could think about was getting home, crawling into bed, and shutting out the world. The air outside was thick with mist, making it hard to see anything beyond the headlights. The quietness felt unnatural, like the whole world had gone to sleep, leaving me alone in this strange, empty place. As I drove, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just my tired mind playing games. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't my imagination. A woman was standing by the side of the road. She looked out of place, almost like she had been dropped there by mistake. Her clothes were plain, nothing special, but she seemed distressed, her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. I slowed down, my heart beating faster as I debated whether or not to stop. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was guilt. I couldn't just leave her there, could I? What if she was in trouble? I pulled over and rolled down the window, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" I asked, hoping she'd say she was fine and wave me off. Instead, she stepped closer, her face still partly hidden in the shadows. "My car broke down," she said quietly. "I need a ride to town." Everything in me screamed to just drive away, but I couldn't. I nodded, telling her to get in. As soon as she opened the door, a wave of cold air hit me, making me shiver. She got in without saying another word, sitting stiffly in the passenger seat. I tried to ignore the discomfort crawling up my spine as I put the car back in gear and started driving. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. I tried to make small talk, asking where exactly she was headed, but her answers were short, almost clipped. Something about the way she spoke was off, like she wasn't really listening. Every time I glanced over at her, she was staring straight ahead, her eyes unblinking. The more I looked at her, the more I noticed how out of place she seemed. Her clothes were clean, but old, like they had been out of style for years. Her hair was messy, but not in a careless way. It was like she hadn't bothered to even brush it. My unease grew with every passing mile. Then, out of nowhere, she said something that made my blood run cold. You always take this road home, don't you? I gripped the steering wheel tighter. How could she know that? I hadn't told her anything about me, and yet she spoke like she knew me. My mouth went dry and I forced a smile, trying to play it off. Yeah, I guess I do. She didn't respond, just kept staring ahead, her expression unreadable. The silence that followed was even worse than before. My mind raced, trying to figure out how she could know something so specific about me. Had she seen me before? Had she been watching me? The thought made my skin crawl. Suddenly, she turned to me, her voice sharp. "Take the next left." I blinked, confused. What? That's not the way to town. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something dark in them. "Take the left," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Panic started to rise in my chest. I realized then that I was in danger, real danger, but I couldn't let her see how scared I was. I nodded slowly, pretending to agree, but my mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this. I kept driving, looking for any chance to escape. I didn't know what she wanted, but I knew I couldn't let her control where we were going. That's when I saw it, a gas station up ahead, its lights like a beacon in the darkness. I made a split-second decision, jerking the wheel to the right, heading straight for it. She didn't react at first, but then she started yelling, telling me to stop, to turn around. I didn't listen. My only thought was to get out of the car, to get somewhere safe. As soon as I pulled into the gas station, I jumped out, shouting for help. The attendant inside looked up, confused, but I didn't care. I ran to the door, banging on it, begging them to let me in. Behind me, the woman just sat there, watching me with that same cold, calculating expression. She didn't even try to follow me. Finally, the attendant unlocked the door, letting me in. I turned to look back at the car, my heart still racing. The woman was getting out, but she didn't come towards me. Instead, she just walked away, disappearing into the night like she had never been there at all. I wanted to chase after her, to ask her why she had done this, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen with fear, unable to do anything but watch her leave. Later, when the police arrived, I told them everything. They searched the area but didn't find her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The officer who took my statement mentioned there had been reports of a woman matching her description involved in a series of crimes, targeting drivers just like me. He told me I was lucky to be alive, that it could have ended much worse. I still don't know what she wanted or why she chose me, but I think about her every time I drive down that road. I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, watching, waiting for her next victim. I don't know why I decided to take that road. It was late, past midnight, and I was driving through a deserted highway that cut through miles of thick forest. I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was going, or so I thought. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, the headlights barely piercing through the dense darkness. The quietness around me was unnerving. The only sound was the hum of my car engine and the occasional rustle of trees when the wind blew. I should have felt calm, but something wasn't right. The longer I drove, the heavier the air felt. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the road for any signs of life. Then, out of nowhere, I saw them, headlights in my rearview mirror. They appeared suddenly, far too quickly. I hadn't noticed a car behind me for miles, and now there it was, coming closer, fast. The car swerved aggressively, the beams of light blinding me as they got closer and closer. My heart started racing. I tried to speed up, but the road was narrow and my car wasn't built for speed. There was nowhere to turn off, nowhere to go. The other car was almost on top of me now, its headlights filling my mirrors, making it hard to see. And then, without warning, the car rammed into me from behind. My whole body jolted with the impact, and I lost control. The car spun off the road, crashing through a barrier and into a ditch. The impact was hard, and everything went black for a second. When I came to, I was still in the driver's seat, the car tilted awkwardly in the ditch. My hands were shaking, and I could hear my own breath, loud and panicked. I wasn't hurt, but I was trapped, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I fumbled for the keys, trying to restart the engine, but it was dead. The headlights had gone out, leaving me in almost complete darkness. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what had just happened, but I didn't have time to think. I saw them, shadows moving in the night, coming closer to my car. There were 3, maybe 4 of them, and they were all wearing masks. They walked with a purpose, their movements quick and deliberate. Panic surged through me. These men weren't here to help. I could feel it in my bones. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run. I unbuckled my seatbelt with trembling hands and forced the door open. As soon as I was out, I bolted into the trees, not even caring which direction I was going, just wanting to get as far away from them as possible. The forest was thick, the branches scratching at my arms and face as I pushed through. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps quick and heavy. They were laughing, low and cruel, and it sent chills down my spine. I tried to stay quiet, but my breath was loud, and I knew they could hear me. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. For what felt like hours, I ran, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out. Every time I thought I had lost them, I'd hear them again, closer, always closer. At one point, I tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. I scrambled up, my heart pounding, and pressed myself against a tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear them nearby, their voices carrying through the darkness. "We know you're out here," one of them called, his voice mocking. "You can't hide forever." My blood turned to ice. They were playing with me, like a cat with a mouse. They knew they had the upper hand. I held my breath, praying they would pass by without seeing me. The silence stretched out, every second feeling like an eternity. Then I heard footsteps right behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body tense. But they kept walking, not noticing me. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then slowly moved, trying to be as quiet as possible. I needed to keep going. I couldn't stay in one place for too long. But the woods were disorienting, and every direction looked the same. My phone was useless, no signal, no way to call for help. I was completely alone, and the terror of that realization almost made me freeze. I couldn't stop, though. I had to keep moving, even if I didn't know where I was going. At some point, I found a small cave, or more like a hollow under some rocks. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crawled inside, pulling myself into the tight space, and tried to calm my breathing. My whole body was shaking, exhaustion finally catching up to me. I heard them again, closer this time. They were searching, their voices low but getting louder. I pressed myself deeper into the hollow, praying they wouldn't find me, but they were getting closer, too close. I could hear the crunch of leaves under their boots, the sound of their breathing. Just when I thought they were about to find me, a noise cut through the night, a car driving down the highway in the distance. The sound was faint, but it was enough to make them stop. For a moment, I dared to hope that the car would stop, that someone would come and save me. But the car kept going, and so did they. They turned away from where I was hiding, and I knew this was my only chance. I waited until they were a good distance away, then crawled out and started running again, my legs almost giving out from exhaustion. The fear was like a fire in my chest, keeping me moving even though I felt like I was about to collapse. I ran and ran, not even looking back, just running for my life. But I could hear them, getting closer again, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. The end was near. I could feel it. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps closing in, right behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized they were right there, just a few steps away. I tried to run faster, but my body was done, and all I could do was keep moving forward, hoping for a miracle. But miracles don't happen in places like this. The last thing I heard was my own heavy breathing, and then the world went black. I was driving alone through the forest that evening. I had planned to reach my destination before dark, but the road was longer than I thought. The sun was already sinking, and the trees around me seemed to close in, their branches forming dark, twisted shapes. The road was narrow, winding, and felt like it could go on forever. The only sound was the steady hum of my car engine, making the silence outside even more noticeable. I started to feel uneasy, like I was the only person left in the world. As I took another sharp turn, I saw something that made my heart stop. A child was standing in the middle of the road. The kid was maybe 8 or 9 years old, just standing there, staring directly at me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The car skidded to a stop just inches from the child. For a few seconds, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the child. The kid didn't move, didn't even blink. There was something unsettling about the way they stared at me. It wasn't just the shock of almost hitting them. It was something else, something in their eyes that made me feel cold inside. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just leave the child there. Maybe they were lost or hurt. I opened the car door and stepped out, my legs feeling shaky. I called out, asking if they were okay, but my voice sounded strange, too loud in the quiet of the forest. But as I walked towards the child, something strange happened. They were gone. One moment, the kid was there, and the next, there was nothing but empty road. I froze, staring at the spot where the child had been. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? No, I was sure I saw them. But now, there was no one. I searched the area, looking around the trees, calling out for the child, but there was no answer, no movement. The forest was completely silent, almost like it was holding its breath. The longer I stood there, the more I started to doubt myself. Had the child been real, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? But I couldn't shake the memory of the child's eyes. That stare. It felt too real to be just my imagination. But what could I do? There was no one here, and the forest felt more and more unfriendly with every passing second. I told myself I should get back to the car, that I should keep driving, but a part of me was afraid. Afraid of what might happen if I left, and afraid of what might happen if I stayed. Finally, I decided to get back in the car and keep going. I couldn't help anyone by standing there, and the longer I stayed, the more uneasy I felt. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see the child standing in the road again. The sun had set completely now, and the forest around me had become a dark, shadowy place. Every shadow looked like it could be something watching me, waiting for me. I tried to focus on the road, but my fear kept growing. The road seemed endless, and I started noticing strange things. Sounds I couldn't explain, like whispers or footsteps, and shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. My heart pounded in my chest, and I had to keep telling myself to breathe, to stay calm. But it wasn't working. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light through the trees. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was a house or another car. Anything would be better than being alone in this dark forest. I decided to stop and check it out. Maybe someone there could help. Or at least I wouldn't be alone. I pulled over and got out, the night air cold against my skin. The light was still there, shining faintly through the trees. I followed a narrow path towards it, feeling more hopeful with each step. But just as I got close, the light went out. Everything was dark again, and I felt a wave of fear crash over me. I realized then that something was wrong, terribly wrong. It was as if the light had been leading me away from my car, away from safety. Panic set in, and I heard something moving in the underbrush. Footsteps. Someone was coming. I didn't wait to see who it was. I turned and ran back toward my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But when I reached the road, I stopped dead in my tracks. The child was there again, standing in front of my car, just like before. They hadn't moved, hadn't changed at all. They were just staring at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. For a moment, I was frozen, staring back at them. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a child. The way they moved, the way their eyes glinted in the dark, there was something wrong, something inhuman about them. I felt a scream building in my throat, but it was stuck, choking me. The child, or whatever it was, took a step towards me. I wanted to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, terror gripping me like a vice. And then, just as the figure reached out towards me, everything went black. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up in my car, the engine still running, the road ahead clear. The sun was rising and the forest looked peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me, waiting for me to come back. I've never driven through that forest again. It was one of those nights where the darkness seemed thicker, heavier, pressing in on me as I drove. I had been on the road for hours, coming back from a work trip that drained every bit of energy from me. The highway was empty, just a straight line cutting through the endless night. The hum of the engine and the soft music playing in the background made my eyelids grow heavy. But I kept telling myself I could make it. Home wasn't far now, just another hour or so. I could push through. But the monotony of the drive lulled me into a false sense of security. I don't even remember when my eyes closed. One moment I was blinking, trying to keep them open, and the next, everything was black. A sudden jolt brought me back. I opened my eyes, but something was wrong. I wasn't on the highway anymore. The road was narrower, winding between tall trees that seemed to close in around me. I hit the brakes, my heart racing. How did I get here? I couldn't remember anything after that last blink. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what was happening. The car was off, the engine silent. I turned the key, but nothing happened. Not even a click. It was like the car had died, and now I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and darkness. The silence was thick, only broken by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I got out of the car, hoping to find something familiar, some clue about where I was. But as I stepped onto the road, I realized this place was completely foreign to me. No street signs, no houses, just an endless stretch of road disappearing into the shadows. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting into the night sky like skeletal fingers. I walked a little, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, each one louder than the last. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a wrong turn, that I could find my way back. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. My memory was a blank, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't recall how I ended up here. It was like the last part of the drive had been wiped from my mind. The air felt colder the further I went, a chill seeping into my bones. Then I saw something. A piece of fabric, torn and caught on a low branch. It was dark, almost blending with the tree bark, but I could make out the texture. It looked like it had been ripped from someone's clothes, frayed and dirty. My stomach twisted. There was no reason for it to be there, no reason for anyone else to be out here. I picked it up, holding it under the faint moonlight. It was wet, and when I looked closer, I saw the dark stain on it. Blood. My heart pounded in my chest as I dropped it, backing away like it was something dangerous. What the hell was going on? I turned back to the car, walking faster now, the darkness pressing in closer. But just as I was about to reach it, I noticed something else. A wallet lying on the ground, half buried in the dirt. I hesitated before picking it up, my hands trembling. It wasn't mine. The ID inside showed a face I didn't recognize. A man in his 30s, smiling like he had no idea his wallet would end up here, in this God-forsaken place. I dropped it and ran to the car, my mind racing. The torn fabric, the wallet, they didn't belong to me. But why were they here? I felt like I was standing on the edge of something terrible, something I didn't want to remember. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find a way back. I jumped into the car, trying the ignition again, but the engine was dead. Panic gripped me as I pounded on the steering wheel, yelling at the car to start, but it was no use. I was trapped, and the only option was to walk, to find help before something worse happened. I started down the road, walking fast, almost running. The road seemed to stretch on forever, looping back on itself. I tried to keep track, counting steps, marking trees, but it was useless. Every time I thought I was making progress, I ended up back where I started. It was like the road was playing tricks on me, leading me in circles. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if I had been here before? What if something had happened that I couldn't remember, something too awful to face? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that I was involved in whatever had left that blood-stained fabric, that abandoned wallet. I was about to give up, to sink down onto the road and let the darkness swallow me. When I saw it, headlights in the distance, coming closer, my heart leapt, a mix of hope and fear. Help was coming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be the kind of help I wanted. The lights grew brighter, closer, and I stood frozen in their path, unsure whether to wave them down or hide. As the car approached, I could make out the shape of the vehicle, but something felt off. It was moving too slow, like it was watching me, like it knew I was there and was deciding what to do next. My breath caught in my throat as it stopped a few feet away, the lights blinding me. I waited for the driver to step out, to say something, but the door never opened. The engine hummed softly, the lights burning into my eyes. I couldn't see anything beyond them, just the blinding white and the silhouette of the car. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The car just sat there, idling, and I knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be good. Last night I drove through a small town I'd never heard of before. It was late, past midnight, and I was heading back home after visiting a friend in a nearby city. The highway was long and I was tired. My eyes felt heavy, and I could feel the weariness in my bones. All I wanted was to reach my bed, but I knew I had at least another hour to go. The town was small, just a few scattered houses, a couple of closed shops, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The streets were empty, not a single car or person in sight. The dim streetlights cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to move as I passed by. It felt like a ghost town, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed the thought away. I just wanted to get home. Suddenly, I noticed flashing lights in my rearview mirror. A police car. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't speeding, so I couldn't figure out why I was being pulled over. I slowed down and pulled to the side of the road, rolling down my window as the officer approached. The man who walked up to my car wore a police uniform, but something about him didn't seem right. His uniform looked slightly wrinkled, like he'd been wearing it for too long. His face was pale, and his eyes didn't meet mine when he asked for my license and registration. There was an odd tone in his voice, too friendly, but with a hint of something darker underneath. I handed him my documents, trying to stay calm. He looked at them briefly, then at me, his smile widening. "Long drive?" he asked, his voice too casual for the situation. I nodded, keeping my answers short. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. Then he started asking questions that had nothing to do with a traffic stop. "Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Why are you driving so late?" His questions felt invasive, like he was trying to get information for some other reason. I started to feel uneasy, my heart beating faster. I couldn't understand why he was asking these things, but I didn't want to make him angry, so I answered as simply as I could. "Can you step out of the car?" he asked suddenly, still smiling. "Just a routine check." My stomach dropped. This didn't feel right at all. I glanced at the patrol car behind me and noticed something strange. It didn't have the usual markings. It was just a plain white car with a light bar on top. My hands started to shake as I looked back at the officer. His badge didn't look quite right either, almost like it was a cheap copy. I didn't know what to do. Should I get out or should I refuse? My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. Everything in me screamed that this man wasn't a real cop, but I was too scared to defy him. Just then, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Another car was coming. The officer's expression changed, his friendly smile slipping for just a moment, replaced by something cold and threatening. He stepped closer to my car, his hand resting on the door, almost like he was trying to block me from leaving. That was when it hit me. This man wasn't a cop. He was pretending, trying to lure me out of the car. My breath caught in my throat and I realized I had to do something, fast. The approaching car was my only chance. With a burst of adrenaline, I made my decision. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands shaking, and slammed the car into gear. The officer yelled something, but I didn't hear it. My tires screeched as I sped off, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't look back. I just drove, faster than I ever had. My eyes locked on the road ahead. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call the real police, but my hands were trembling so much I could barely dial. When I finally got through, I explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The dispatcher tried to calm me down, but all I could think about was that man and what might have happened if I'd gotten out of the car. The supposed officer didn't chase me, which only made the situation more terrifying. It was like he knew he didn't need to. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station in the next town, where I finally pulled over, shaking and on the verge of tears. The police arrived not long after, but by then, the fake cop was long gone. They took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't expect to find him. I asked them if this had happened before, and one of the officers hesitated before telling me that there had been a few similar reports in the area. I made it home eventually, but I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that fake smile, and the cold look in his eyes when he realized I was onto him. I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if that other car hadn't shown up when it did. Now, every time I'm driving at night, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. That man is still out there, and I know I'll never forget that night. The fear lingers, a dark shadow that follows me whenever I'm alone on the road. I keep asking myself, what if he finds me again? I was tired, so tired that my eyes felt heavy as I drove home. It had been a long day at work, and all I wanted was to collapse into bed. The road was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered around. I was zoning out, thinking about how good it would feel to be home, when suddenly, a car swerved in front of me, cutting me off. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I barely avoided hitting it. I honked my horn angrily, throwing my hand up in frustration. The driver ahead responded with a gesture that was anything but polite. My blood boiled, but I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to get home. So I took a deep breath, let it go, and watched as the other car sped away, disappearing around the corner. I thought that was the end of it. Just another case of road rage in this crazy city. But then, as I continued driving, I noticed something strange. In my rearview mirror, the same car appeared again. It was following me, not too close, but close enough that I couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't a coincidence. I tried to tell myself it was just going in the same direction, but each turn I made, it made too. My hands started to sweat, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I turned off my usual route, taking a different way home. Maybe they were just heading the same way, I reasoned. But no, they kept following me. My heart pounded faster with each passing minute. My mind raced, thinking of all the stories I'd heard about people being followed, things ending badly. I didn't want to be one of those stories. I considered calling the police, but hesitated. What would I even say? Someone's following me? It seemed like such a small thing, something that might be nothing. I didn't want to overreact, so I kept driving, hoping they'd get bored or realize I wasn't worth the trouble. Finally, I reached my neighborhood, the familiar streets offering little comfort. I pulled into my driveway, glancing in the mirror to see the car had stopped a few houses down, engine idling. I sat there for a moment, staring at the car, hoping it would drive off, but it didn't. It just sat there, like a predator watching its prey. I didn't want to show I was scared, but I was. I forced myself to move, getting out of the car and hurrying to the front door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the heavy silence around me only making my nerves worse. I finally got the door open, rushing inside and locking it behind me. For a few seconds, I stood there in the darkness, trying to calm down. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe it was some sick joke. But then I heard it, the sound of a car door opening, followed by footsteps approaching my house. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I peeked through the peephole and saw him. A man, probably in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, standing on my porch. He looked angry, his face twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. He knocked on the door, loud and forceful, each knock making me flinch. Then he started shouting, his voice muffled but full of anger. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. He wasn't here for a friendly chat. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. My voice shook as I explained the situation, trying to keep it together while the dispatcher asked questions. They said the police were on their way, but I wasn't sure I could wait that long. The man outside was getting more aggressive. I heard the door handle rattle as he tried to get in. Panic surged through me. I needed to protect myself. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the first thing I could find, a heavy frying pan. It felt ridiculous, but it was all I had. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, pushing the dresser against the door. I could still hear him outside, banging on windows, shouting threats. It felt like time was moving in slow motion, each second stretching out into eternity. I kept the frying pan close, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for him to break through. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. What if the police didn't get here in time? What if he managed to break in before they arrived? But the sirens grew louder, and soon I heard a car screech to a stop outside. The banging stopped, and I heard footsteps running away. I stayed where I was, too scared to move, until I heard the voices of the police officers calling out. I slowly unblocked the door and opened it, still clutching the frying pan like it was my last line of defense. The police were professional, taking my statement and searching the area. But the man was gone, vanished into the night like a bad dream. They assured me they would patrol the area, but I could tell they didn't think he would come back. They left after a while, and I was alone again. But I wasn't really alone. The fear stayed with me, a constant presence in the dark. Every creak, every rustle outside made me jump. I kept imagining him out there, watching, waiting for another chance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only just escaped, that next time I might not be so lucky. It's been weeks since that night, but I still can't sleep. I keep the doors locked, double-check the windows, but it's not enough. I know I'll never feel safe here again. Every time I see a car like his, my heart skips a beat. I'm always looking over my shoulder, wondering if he'll come back to finish what he started. And the worst part? I know he's still out there somewhere. I've driven through a lot of places in this country, but there was something about that stretch of highway that felt different. It was empty and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel small and alone. I had been driving for hours, and when I saw the small gas station up ahead, I decided to stop. I wasn't low on gas, but my legs were stiff, and I could use a break. The gas station didn't look like much, just a single pump and a tiny shop with a faded sign. The kind of place that felt forgotten by time. I pulled up and parked, looking around. There was nothing but flat, open land as far as I could see. The sun was low, casting long shadows that made everything look just a bit darker. Inside the shop, it was dim and smelled like old coffee. The clerk behind the counter was a man in his late 40s with a friendly enough smile, but there was something off about him. He watched me too closely, like he was waiting for something. I grabbed a soda and walked to the counter. He rang me up, making small talk that didn't seem natural. "Long drive?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, not really wanting to chat. "Where you headed?" I hesitated. "Just passing through." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful on these roads. You never know what might happen out here." I forced a smile, paid for my drink, and left quickly, not wanting to stay in that place any longer. I got back in my car, took a deep breath, and pulled back onto the highway. The sun was setting fast, and I still had a long way to go before I could rest. A few miles down the road, I noticed an old rusty pickup truck behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I drove, the truck stayed right behind me, never passing or falling back. It was just there, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. I tried to shake it off as nothing, but I couldn't ignore the unease growing in my chest. My thoughts went back to the gas station and the strange clerk. His words echoed in my mind, making me feel colder than the night air. You never know what might happen out here. The truck was still there, following me closely. It matched my speed, turned when I turned, and never seemed to back off. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as my heart began to race. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a coincidence. I tried speeding up, thinking I could lose them, but the truck only sped up too. I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of the driver, but the headlights were too bright, blinding me. Panic started to set in, and I could feel sweat on my forehead. My mind raced. Why were they following me? What did they want? And why did I feel like this had something to do with that gas station? I didn't remember telling the clerk where I was going. So how did he know? I took a sudden turn onto a smaller road, hoping to throw off the truck, but it followed without hesitation. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't outrun them. I was being hunted. In a moment of desperation, I decided to confront them. My car skidded to a stop on the side of the road, kicking up dust. The truck stopped a few feet behind me, its engine still running. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it would burst out of my chest. For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that makes you realize how alone you really are. The door of the truck creaked open, and out stepped the clerk from the gas station. The same man who had seemed too interested in my trip, who had watched me too closely. He didn't look like the friendly man who had rung up my drink. His smile was twisted, his eyes dark and knowing. He walked towards my car slowly, like he had all the time in the world. "You're a long way from home," he said, his voice carrying in the still night air. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, too scared to move, to think. He knew something about me, something he shouldn't. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine through the car window. "I've been watching you for a while," he whispered. "You really should be more careful." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just today. He had been following me for longer than I realized, watching, waiting for the right moment. I felt sick, trapped in my own car with no idea how to escape this nightmare. But just as I thought it was over, I saw headlights in the distance. Another car, coming this way. The clerk noticed too, and his smile faded. In that brief second of distraction, I found my courage. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped off, leaving the clerk behind in a cloud of dust. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance between us as possible. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart racing, my mind spinning. Every car behind me made me jump. Every shadow made me shiver. I didn't stop until I reached a town, its lights a welcome sight after the dark, empty road. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I'm still driving now, and every time I look in the rearview mirror, I half expect to see that old rusty truck again. Maybe I'm safe. Maybe it's over. But a part of me knows that this isn't something you just get away from. I'll always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the nightmare to start again. I picked up my car from the mechanic last Tuesday. It was supposed to be a simple job, just an oil change and a routine checkup. The guy at the shop, Steve, had insisted on checking the brakes and a few other things. I didn't argue. Better safe than sorry, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that Steve seemed too eager, almost like he was hoping to find something wrong. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Mechanics are like that. They always find something else to fix. The first few miles after leaving the shop were uneventful. Everything felt normal at first, but by the time I got on the highway, I noticed a strange noise coming from under the hood. It was faint, but there was a sort of rattling sound that hadn't been there before. I turned up the radio to drown it out, hoping it was just my imagination. But the noise was persistent, nagging at me in the background. Then, the brakes started to feel off. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, but the more I drove, the more I noticed it. The brake pedal felt softer, like I had to press harder than usual to get the car to stop. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, and it was enough to make me uneasy. By the time I was halfway home, I was gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. That's when it happened. A car in front of me slammed on its brakes, and I had to react fast. I pushed down on the brake pedal hard, but the car didn't slow down as quickly as it should have. I swerved, barely avoiding the car in front of me. My heart was pounding, and I pulled over to the side of the road trying to calm myself down. I sat there for a few minutes, hands shaking, trying to make sense of what just happened. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was definitely wrong with the car. I thought about turning back, going straight to the mechanic and demanding answers, but something stopped me. A weird gut feeling told me not to go back. What if Steve had done something? But why would he? It didn't make sense. I decided to keep driving, but this time I was extra cautious, paying close attention to every little sound and movement the car made. When I finally got home, I parked the car in the driveway and just sat there for a while, listening to the engine as it idled. That strange rattling was still there, faint but constant. I turned off the engine and popped the hood, even though I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for. Under the hood, everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something weird. A few parts didn't look right, like they didn't belong there. They were shiny and new, while everything else was covered in a thin layer of dust and grime, as you'd expect in an older car. My stomach churned. I wasn't a car expert, but I knew enough to realize that those new parts hadn't been there before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the car and the strange behavior of the mechanic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, that maybe the mechanic had tampered with my car. But why? What could he possibly gain from that? The next day, I decided to get a second opinion. I took the car to a different mechanic, one that a friend had recommended. The guy there, Tom, was older and seemed more trustworthy. I didn't tell him anything about my suspicions. I just asked him to take a look and tell me if everything was okay. Tom called me a few hours later, and his voice was tense. He asked me to come to the shop as soon as possible. When I got there, he showed me what he'd found. Several parts of the car had been tampered with, deliberately, it seemed. The brake lines had been partially cut, and some of the bolts on the suspension had been loosened. Tom told me that if I had continued driving the car like that, it was only a matter of time before something catastrophic happened, like the brakes failing completely or the car losing control at high speed. I felt sick. Someone had tried to kill me. That was the only conclusion that made sense. But who? And why? I went back to Steve's shop shaking with anger and fear. I confronted him, showing him the report from the other mechanic. But Steve just stared at me, his face blank. Then he started laughing, a low, creepy sound that sent chills down my spine. He didn't admit to anything, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to say anything, and I wasn't going to get any answers. I left the shop, feeling more confused and scared than ever. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I got into my new car, I double-checked everything, even though I knew it was probably fine. But the paranoia wouldn't go away. I started avoiding driving whenever I could, taking public transport or walking instead. Then last night, I found a note on my windshield. It was typed, not handwritten, and it said, "You shouldn't have messed with things you don't understand." My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the paper. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. Now, I'm sitting here, typing this out, trying to make sense of it all. I don't know who left the note or what they meant by it. All I know is that I can't trust anyone, not even the people who are supposed to fix my car. I'm scared, and I don't know what to do next. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but something tells me this isn't over. I don't know why I stopped the car that day. Maybe it was the endless desert stretching in all directions, the emptiness of the road, or just the need for some human contact after hours of driving alone. But when I saw him standing there, thumb out, sweat soaking through his shirt, I felt something tug at me, telling me to stop. He looked desperate, lost in the middle of nowhere. I could see it in his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had been out in the sun too long, maybe even seen too much. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. My instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but something stronger pulled me over to the side of the road. "Thanks for stopping," he said as he slid into the passenger seat. His voice was rough, like he hadn't had water in days. "I've been out here for hours. My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been walking ever since." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. The silence of the desert was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine. I could feel his gaze on me, but I didn't turn to look at him. Something about the situation didn't feel right, but I told myself it was just my nerves. We drove in silence for a few miles. He didn't say much, just stared out the window as the barren landscape passed by. I started to relax, thinking I had made the right choice by picking him up. After all, it's what anyone would do, right? Help a fellow human in need. Then he started talking. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, still looking out the window. "No," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. "Just passing through." "Yeah, I figured," he said, his tone casual. "You don't look like the type to be out here. Not after what happened in that little town you used to live in. What was it called again?" My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told him where I was from. There was no way he could know that. I glanced at him, but he was still looking out the window, like he hadn't just said something strange. "It's funny," he continued, his voice smooth now, almost too smooth. "How you can leave a place, but it never really leaves you. Like that job you quit. Must have been tough, walking away like that after everything you did." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. How did he know about that? I hadn't told anyone, not even my closest friends. It was supposed to be behind me, something I left in the past. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He finally turned to look at me, a smile playing on his lips. But there was no warmth in his eyes, just cold, hard knowledge. "Just a guy who's been around," he said. "You meet a lot of people, hear a lot of stories. It's amazing what people will tell you if you listen long enough." I felt a chill run down my spine. This man wasn't lost. He wasn't stranded. He was here for a reason, and that reason had something to do with me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the fear was creeping in, making my hands shake. "Oh, I think you do," he replied, his tone darkening. "You think you can just run away, leave it all behind. But the past has a funny way of catching up with you." My mind raced, trying to figure out who this man was, what he wanted from me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't place him. He was just a stranger, but he knew too much. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to the side of the road. "Get out," I demanded, my voice shaking. "Get out of my car." But he didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me with those cold eyes. "You think you can get rid of me that easily?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "I've been following you for a long time, watching you, waiting for the right moment." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the truth. This wasn't a coincidence. This man had been following me, tracking me down. But why? What did he want? "You can't run from your past," he said, leaning closer. "No matter how far you drive, no matter how fast you go, it's always there, waiting for you." I was trapped, miles from civilization, with no way to escape. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. But before I could react, he did something I didn't expect. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, but a knowing one, like he had won some kind of twisted game. "I'll let you go this time," he said, opening the door and stepping out. "But we'll meet again. And next time, you won't be so lucky." He stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him. I watched as he walked away, disappearing into the desert. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. I drove away, my hands shaking, my mind racing. The desert stretched out before me, endless and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that somewhere out there, he was still watching me. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. He would be back, and when he returned, I wouldn't be able to run away again. The past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you go. And when it does, there's no escape. I was driving down this old, lonely road, the kind that doesn't show up on maps anymore. The sun had almost disappeared, and the sky was a deep orange, fading into night. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and I had no idea where I was. I was getting frustrated, and honestly, a bit scared. I kept hoping for some sign of life, a gas station, a house, anything, but there was nothing. Just trees on both sides and the road stretching out forever. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A car on the side of the road. It was old and covered in dirt, like it had been there for a long time. The sight of it made my heart jump. Maybe someone was there, someone who could help. Or maybe it had something useful inside. I was desperate enough to find out. I pulled over and got out of my car, the crunch of gravel under my shoes sounding too loud in the quiet evening. The closer I got, the more out of place the car seemed. The windows were fogged up, and the whole thing just looked wrong, like it didn't belong there. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just an old car someone abandoned here. When I got to the driver's side, I reached for the handle, hesitated for a second, and then opened the door. The smell hit me like a punch in the face. Rotten, sickening. I gagged and had to step back for a second. But curiosity got the better of me, so I leaned in to look inside. That's when I saw it. Blood. There were bloodstains on the seat, dried and dark, and a torn piece of clothing on the floor, like someone had been struggling. My heart started pounding in my chest. I wasn't just scared now. I was terrified. This wasn't just an abandoned car. Something bad had happened here, something really bad. I thought about getting back in my car and driving away as fast as I could, but something kept me there. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the need to know more. I don't know. I looked around, checking if anyone was nearby. The road was still empty, and the trees stood still, as if they were watching me. I didn't see or hear anything unusual, so I went back to the car and started searching more carefully. Under the seat, I found an old faded photograph. It showed a family, parents, and a little girl, all smiling. The photo looked familiar, like I had seen these faces before, but I couldn't remember where. That only made me more uneasy. As I kept searching, I started hearing things, soft noises, like whispers or footsteps. But whenever I looked around, there was nothing there. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened in this car. But the more I thought about it, the more scared I became. I felt like I was being watched, like someone or something was out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. And then I heard it, a loud thump from the trunk of the car. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, or maybe something fell inside. But the noise came again, more insistent this time. Whatever was in there was alive. I didn't want to open the trunk. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know what was in there. With shaking hands, I moved to the back of the car and reached for the trunk latch. I hesitated, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. and then I lifted it. Inside, there was a person, a woman, tied up and unconscious. She looked like she had been through hell, bruises all over her, dried blood on her face. She was barely breathing. For a moment, I just stared, too shocked to move. This wasn't just a crime scene. I had stumbled into something much worse. I snapped out of it and tried to untie her, but the knots were tight, and my hands were trembling so badly that I couldn't get a grip. As I was struggling with the ropes, I heard the sound of another car approaching. My blood ran cold. Whoever was coming could be the person who did this, the person responsible for the blood, the photograph, and the woman in the trunk. I looked around for a place to hide, but it was too late. The car stopped behind mine and I heard the door open. I ducked down, hoping they wouldn't see me, but when I glanced up, I saw someone walking toward me. They hadn't noticed me yet, but it wouldn't be long. I had to make a choice: run, hide, or confront them. But no option seemed safe. If I ran, they might catch me. If I hid, they might find me. If I confronted them, I didn't want to think about what would happen. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, but time was running out. As the person got closer, I realized that I might not make it out of this alive. The fear was overwhelming, choking me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I was in serious danger, and there was no one around to help me. I had never felt so alone, so helpless. The last thing I remember is the figure looming over me, their face shadowed by the fading light. And then, nothing. Just darkness. That's where my story ends, because I don't know what happened next. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this, and I still can't believe it. All I can say is, if you ever find an abandoned car on a lonely road, don't stop. Keep driving and don't look back. You never know what you might find, or what might find you. I was running late. It was one of those nights where everything seemed to go wrong. My boss had thrown an unexpected task at me just as I was about to leave work, and now I was rushing to an important event, one I couldn't afford to miss. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with stress. The dashboard clock blinked at me, reminding me that time was slipping away. The route I usually took was packed with traffic, so I made a quick decision. I would take the back road. It wasn't the first time I'd taken it, but tonight, it felt different. The road was darker, quieter. Trees leaned over the narrow lane, their branches almost touching in the middle, forming a sort of tunnel that blocked out the moonlight. It felt like driving into a cave, but I told myself it was just my nerves. The shortcut would save me a few precious minutes, and I needed every one of them. As I drove deeper into the darkness, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a faint shadow, nothing that stood out. But then I saw it again, a car. It had no headlights on, just creeping along behind me. I squinted into the mirror, trying to get a better look, but it was hard to see. The car seemed to blend into the night, just a dark shape following me at a distance. I told myself not to worry. Maybe they forgot to turn their lights on, or maybe it was someone who lived nearby, used to these roads. But a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I pressed down on the gas a little, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car stayed with me, its presence like a shadow I couldn't shake. The knot in my stomach tightened. I was starting to feel like something was very wrong. The road was getting narrower, the trees closer. It felt like the walls were closing in. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, but the car behind me sped up too, keeping pace. It was too close now, almost tailgating me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were doing it on purpose. My mind raced. Was it a prank? Someone messing with me? Or was it something worse? I didn't have time to think it through. The car behind me swerved suddenly, then jerked back in line like they were trying to force me off the road. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pressed the gas pedal harder, trying to get away. But the road twisted and turned, and the other car matched my every move. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, my thoughts spinning out of control. Why were they doing this? What did they want? I didn't know, and that terrified me more than anything. Suddenly, the car behind me rammed into the back of my car. The impact jolted me forward, and I struggled to keep control of the wheel. I swerved, nearly going off the road, but managed to straighten out just in time. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't just some joke. They were trying to hurt me, maybe even kill me. I had to do something. I couldn't keep driving like this, knowing that at any moment they could push me off the road. I scanned the area for an escape, anything that could get me out of this nightmare. Then I saw it, a narrow dirt path branching off to the left, barely wide enough for my car. Without thinking, I jerked the wheel and took the turn. The tires skidded on the loose gravel, and for a moment, I thought I was going to lose control. But the car held, and I sped down the path, my heart in my throat. The trees closed in even tighter, branches scraping against the windows like claws trying to reach inside. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the other car following, the roar of its engine echoing in the night. I pushed the car harder, faster, feeling it shake beneath me as I flew down the narrow path. The road twisted and turned, and I prayed it wouldn't lead me into a dead end. The sound of the other car was still there, but it was fading, growing more distant. I didn't know if I was losing them or if they were just toying with me, letting me think I had a chance. Finally, the path opened up, leading back onto a main road. I saw lights in the distance, street lights, houses, safety. I floored it, desperate to get out of the dark, out of the trees, out of this nightmare. The other car didn't follow. I didn't know where it went, and I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, its bright lights a beacon in the dark. I pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing. Who was that? Why were they after me? I had no answers, just a deep gnawing fear that refused to go away. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched, that they're out there somewhere, waiting for another chance. Every time I drive at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that car with no headlights, creeping up behind me. I don't know what I would do if I saw it again. Maybe I'd be ready this time. Or maybe I wouldn't be so lucky. I was on my way to my friend's new place, trying to follow the directions he gave me. It was a part of town I'd never been to before, and I wasn't exactly comfortable driving through unfamiliar streets. My GPS kept losing signal, and my phone battery was dying, but I wasn't too worried. I figured I could manage. After all, it was just a short drive across town, and I was used to finding my way around. But as I drove further, I started to feel uneasy. The streets were getting narrower, and the houses looked older, some of them even boarded up. There were fewer cars, fewer people. The lights were dim, and shadows seemed to stretch out across the road, making everything look darker than it should. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. Then I made a wrong turn. It was one of those quick decisions you make without thinking, like when you suddenly realize you're in the wrong lane and it's too late to fix it. I turned down a side street thinking I could just loop around and get back on track. But that didn't happen. Instead, I found myself in a neighborhood that didn't look anything like where I was supposed to be. The houses were all run down, the streets cracked and empty. I tried to pull up the map on my phone, but the signal was gone, and my battery was almost dead. Panic started to creep in. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't have any way to call for help. I kept driving, hoping to find a main road or at least a familiar landmark, but the more I drove, the more lost I felt. The streets twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the heart of this strange, abandoned place. I noticed there were no street signs, no names on the buildings, nothing to tell me where I was. Just empty houses with broken windows, and old cars that hadn't moved in years. Finally, I saw a group of people standing around a corner, talking quietly among themselves. They were the first signs of life I'd seen in what felt like hours, and even though something about them made me nervous, I was desperate. I pulled over and rolled down my window, hoping they could give me directions. "Excuse me, can you help me? I'm trying to get to Maple Street." "Do you know where that is?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They all turned to look at me at the same time, like they hadn't noticed my car before. Their faces were mostly hidden in the shadows, but I could see their eyes, and something about the way they stared made me shiver. There was a long pause, and they exchanged glances, like they were deciding something. Finally, one of them stepped forward. He was a tall, thin man with a hood pulled up over his head. "Maple Street? Yeah, I can show you the way," he said in a low voice. "But you'll have to park your car and come with me. It's easier to walk from here." Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea, but I couldn't see any other choice. My phone was dead, I was lost, and they were the only people around who could help. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded, trying to push down the fear that was rising in my chest. "Okay, thanks," I said, and parked my car on the side of the road. I grabbed my keys and followed the man as he led me down a narrow alleyway. The alley was dark, even darker than the streets I had driven through. The buildings on either side seemed to close in on us, the walls almost touching. The man walked ahead of me, his steps slow and deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I noticed that the others from the group were following us at a distance, their footsteps echoing softly behind me. My heart was pounding now, and I started to realize how stupid I'd been. This was wrong, all of it. I shouldn't have left my car, shouldn't have trusted these strangers. I was in a place I didn't know, with people I didn't know, and everything about this situation was screaming at me to run. But I kept walking, telling myself that it was too late to back out now. The man ahead of me hadn't said anything since we left the car, and his silence was making me more nervous with every step. I tried to ask him again, "How far is Maple Street?" But my voice came out shaky, barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer. He just kept walking, leading me deeper into the darkness. The alley seemed to get narrower and narrower until there was barely enough room for us to walk side by side. I started to notice things: broken glass on the ground, the faint smell of something rotting, the way the air felt heavier, like we were moving underground. Then I heard it, a faint shuffle behind me, like someone was trying to sneak up without making a sound. I glanced back and saw the others were closer now, their faces still hidden in the shadows, but their intent clear. They were following us, following me, and I realized they had been from the moment I got out of the car. Panic hit me hard. I stopped walking, my heart racing as I looked around, trying to find a way out. "I think I should go back," I said, my voice trembling. "I can find my way from here." The man ahead of me finally stopped and turned around. His face was blank, cold. "No, you can't," he said flatly. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and ran, bolting back the way we had come. I heard them shouting, their footsteps pounding after me, but I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, my mind focused on one thing: getting back to my car. The alley felt longer than before, stretching out in front of me like a nightmare that wouldn't end. But finally, I saw the street ahead, my car still parked where I left it. I didn't slow down, didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door shut and jamming the key into the ignition. They were close now, almost on top of me, but I got the engine started just in time. I floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as I sped away, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get as far away from them as possible. I didn't stop driving until I was back in a part of town I recognized. My hands were shaking, my heart still pounding in my chest. Even when I finally reached my friend's house, I couldn't calm down. The fear lingered, gnawing at me, making me jump at every shadow. And even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that those people are still out there, waiting for the next lost stranger to cross their path. I never thought that a simple drive home could turn into a nightmare. I was just leaving work, tired, and wanting to get home as quickly as possible. The roads were mostly empty, and I was lost in my thoughts, thinking about what to eat for dinner when it happened. A car came out of nowhere, speeding, and almost slammed into me. My heart jumped to my throat as I swerved to avoid the crash. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I barely managed to keep control of my car. I honked, but the other car sped off, disappearing into the night. I was shaken, but I tried to shake it off. Close calls happen all the time, right? I made it home, locked the door behind me, and tried to forget about it. But the unease lingered, a small voice in the back of my mind telling me something wasn't right. The next morning, I got a message from an unknown number. It was short, just 4 words. Watch where you're going next time. My stomach tightened as I stared at the screen. Who would send this? I showed it to a friend later, and they laughed it off, saying it was probably just some prankster or maybe someone who got my number by mistake. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the car from last night. Days passed, and more messages came. Each one was a little more personal, a little more terrifying. The second message was simple. Nice house you have. The third was worse. You look tired today. My blood ran cold. How did they know where I lived? How did they see me? I started feeling like someone was always watching me. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, avoiding eye contact with strangers, feeling paranoid in my own home. The fear was growing, and it was becoming harder to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. One evening, I saw it. The same car that nearly crashed into me, parked outside my house. My breath caught in my throat. I could see the silhouette of someone sitting inside, watching. I felt a wave of panic but tried to stay calm. Maybe it wasn't the same car, I told myself, but I knew it was. The driver wanted me to know they were there. My hands shook as I called the police. They came, checked the area, and of course, by then, the car was gone. They told me they would keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Just some paranoid person jumping at shadows, they probably thought. The messages didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. You should lock your door, one read, sent just after I had come home one night. I rushed to check my locks, but everything was secure. Another message arrived the next morning. You left your window open. That one hit me hard. I hadn't noticed the window being open. My mind was racing. Had they been inside my house? I checked every room, but nothing was out of place. Still, the feeling of being watched, of someone knowing my every move, was driving me crazy. I started doubting myself. Was I imagining things? Was I overreacting? But the fear was real. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, always there, always waiting. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I tracked the number, did some digging, and found out where the messages were coming from. It led me to a remote area far from the city. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next message or worse. I had to confront them, to end this nightmare. I drove out to the location, my heart pounding in my chest the entire way. The road was dark, the kind of dark that swallows up the headlights. I finally saw it, parked on the side of the road, the car that had haunted me for weeks. It was just sitting there, engine off, no lights on. My hands were trembling as I got out of my car, but I forced myself to move forward. I had to end this. I had to. As I approached the car, everything felt wrong. It was too quiet. The air was thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I reached the car and peered inside. It was empty. No one was there. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Had they run away? Had they known I was coming? Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. The sound of a door clicking shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but all I saw was darkness. My breath quickened, panic setting in. I was trapped. I could feel it. I wasn't alone out here, and I had walked right into their trap. The last thing I remember was the feeling of someone's presence, close and menacing. I don't know what happened next, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is that the messages have stopped, but the fear hasn't gone away. I can still feel them, watching, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. If you're reading this, please be careful. Sometimes, the scariest things are the ones that are real. I was driving home late that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I navigated the winding roads of the countryside. The road was empty, and the silence outside was broken only by the soft music playing on the radio. It was one of those old stations that played songs from decades ago, and it brought me some comfort, reminding me of easier times. The sky was dark, with only a few stars visible, and the headlights of my car barely pierced the surrounding blackness. As I drove, the music suddenly stopped. At first, I thought it was a weak signal. It wasn't unusual for radio stations to cut out in this area, but what came next made my heart race. Instead of static, a voice crackled through the speakers. It wasn't just any voice. It said my name, clear and direct, like the person was sitting right next to me. "Keep driving, John," the voice said. "I know you're scared, but you need to listen." I froze. How did this person know my name? I reached for the dial, trying to switch stations, but the voice continued, no matter how many times I turned the knob. "Don't change the channel, John. Just keep driving. Take the next right, or you'll regret it." My pulse quickened. I was alone on this road, miles away from any town or house, and the voice on the radio knew things about me it shouldn't. I thought about ignoring it, just driving straight home, but something inside me hesitated. What if something bad did happen? I didn't believe in omens, but the fear was real, gnawing at me. Against my better judgment, I took the right turn. The road I turned onto was narrower, rougher. Trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches casting eerie shadows in the headlights. I felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me. The voice on the radio kept talking, saying things about my life, details that no stranger should know. It talked about my job, my family, and a childhood memory I hadn't thought about in years. The more it talked, the more I started to believe that this voice knew me better than I knew myself. "Keep going, John. You're almost there," the voice urged. I wanted to turn back, to find a way out of this nightmare, but the road was too narrow, and there was no place to turn around. My hands were sweaty, slipping on the wheel, and my heart pounded in my chest. The deeper I drove into the woods, the darker it got. The voice in the car became more insistent, pushing me forward without explaining why. I began to feel like a puppet, being led by unseen strings into something terrible. Finally, the voice commanded, "Stop the car." I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake. The road ahead was nothing but darkness, and I could barely make out anything beyond the beam of the headlights. But the voice was firm, almost angry. "Stop the car, John, now." I pressed down on the brake and the car rolled to a stop. The second the car halted, the radio went silent and the engine died. Panic surged through me. I tried the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and I was trapped in this pitch-black nightmare. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was out there watching me. Then I heard them. Footsteps, coming from the woods. They were slow, deliberate, crunching the gravel just beyond the reach of my headlights. My breath caught in my throat. I flicked the lights on and off, trying to see who or what was out there, but the road remained empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right beside the car. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest as I fumbled for my phone. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The footsteps stopped right next to the driver's door. My skin crawled as if I could feel eyes on me, someone, or something, peering in through the darkness. I was out of options. In a moment of sheer terror, I twisted the key in the ignition again. The engine roared to life and the headlights flared up, but the road was still empty. No one was there. I didn't waste any time. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away, gravel kicking up behind me. As I drove, the radio came back to life, blasting the same voice as before. Only now it was laughing. A cold, mocking laugh that echoed through the car. "You can't run forever, John," the voice taunted. "I'll be waiting." I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, my knuckles white from gripping the wheel so hard. Even when I was back in familiar territory, the fear didn't leave me. I could still hear that voice, those footsteps in my mind. Weeks have passed since that night, and I've tried to convince myself it was just a prank, maybe some weird coincidence. But deep down, I know that's not true. Every time I get in my car, I hesitate before turning on the radio. What if that voice comes back? I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something is out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I think I hear it again. Just a faint whisper over the radio. "Soon, John. Soon." I know it's only a matter of time before it catches up to me. I'm not sure where to start, but I guess it's best to just dive in. I was driving home late last night. It was around 1 a.m. and the road was completely empty. I usually don't drive that late, but I had stayed longer than I planned at a friend's house, and now I just wanted to get home and sleep. The road was narrow and the fog had rolled in thick, like a blanket wrapping around everything. The headlights barely cut through it. I had to keep my speed low because it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The radio wasn't working out there, so it was just me, the hum of the engine and the quiet rustling of trees outside. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud thud. The car jerked like I had hit something heavy. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I slammed on the brakes, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The car came to a stop, and the only sound was the echo of the thud still ringing in my ears. For a few seconds, I just sat there, breathing hard, trying to process what had happened. Did I hit an animal? Or worse, a person? The thought made my stomach twist. The fog was so thick that I could barely see the road in front of me, but I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to check. I didn't want to get out. Every instinct told me to stay in the car, but what if someone was hurt? I couldn't ignore that. Slowly, I opened the door, the cold air rushing in. mixing with the stale warmth inside. I stepped out, my feet crunching on the gravel. The fog seemed to swallow everything, even the sound of my footsteps. I walked to the front of the car, half expecting to see a body or a mangled deer, but there was nothing. Just an empty road stretching into the fog. I squinted, trying to see further, but it was useless. I walked a bit further, my breath shaky, each step feeling heavier than the last. Still nothing. No blood, no fur, no signs of anything. It was like I had imagined the whole thing. I turned back to the car, and that's when I noticed it. The front of the car was fine. No dents, no scratches, but the engine was dead. I tried turning the key, but it wouldn't start. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, with fog so thick I could barely see my own hands. My phone was in the car, so I got back inside and grabbed it. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. My hands were shaking now, and I kept glancing at the fog outside, feeling like it was closing in on me. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what to do. My mind was racing, jumping to the worst possible conclusions. What if I did hit someone, and they were out there, hurt? But if that was the case, where were they? And why wasn't there any sign of it? The fog was so thick, it felt like it was pressing against the windows, like it was alive, pushing in on me. I swear I could almost hear something outside, like footsteps. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just the fog. I couldn't stay in the car. I had to go back and check the road again, make sure I didn't miss anything.